Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Lara Friedman. I'm the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Today is October 14th, 2024, and I am very honored to have with me today Mouin Rabbani.
Thank you,
Mouin,
Lara. It's an honor to be with you, particularly given all the fantastic work you and the Foundation for Middle East Peace have been doing for so many years.
well, thank you, Mouin. I feel the same way about your work. Let me do a really quick bio. I'll have links to everything in the show notes, but very quickly, he has published and commented widely on Palestinian affairs, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, contemporary Middle East. He was previously senior analyst for Middle East and special advisor on Israel-Palestine with the International Crisis Group and head of political affairs with the Office of the United Nations Special Envoy for Syria. And he is the co-editor of Jadaliyya E-zine, and I'll have a link to that in the show notes. I will say since October 2023 in particular, Mouin has become one of the go-to and most prominent voices providing expert analysis on what's going on, including deep historical context, most of which he posts in very expert threads on X. I'll have a link to a collection of those. Each of those I would call something of a master class on the topic at hand. They really are a service to the world. So very happy. We're going to get into this in a second. It's become sort of trite to say that no matter how bad things are, how bad things have been, they just keep getting worse. We're going to be sort of taking a 10,000-foot approach in this podcast. So I first, though, want to anchor us in a quick summary, telegraphically, sort of what's happening right at this moment and what's brought us to today. So very quickly, Gaza, genocide, starvation, displacement, continuing terrorizing of the entire population. That continues. I'll point out the recent UN report which found that Israel's actions in Gaza constitute, quote, the war crimes of willful killing and mistreatment and the crime against humanity of extermination. Most of us last night, as we were going to bed, or this morning, this is in the Western Hemisphere, woke up to video and pictures of people being burnt alive in camps in the Jadaliyya refugee camp. This is on the camps next to a hospital. There's discussion of the ongoing implementation of what is known as the General's Plan, which Mouin may want to talk about. And of course, for the entire population of Gaza that is now displaced, much of it is now living, that population is now living on beaches as we come into winter. And anyone who spent winter in the Mediterranean knows that that is not a healthy or even livable place for people to be. I will just add there's news today in The Guardian that the headline U.S. officials attend Gaza aid meetings on site of Israeli prison accused of horrific torture. Really, every day there's something new. In the West Bank, we have continued ethnic cleansing, and now we have the targeting of the olive harvest that is escalating. And of course, in Lebanon, we've been seeing now for weeks the recycling of the same approach that we had in Gaza, forced displacement under the guise of quote unquote evacuation, treating everyone as a legitimate target, treating any civilians killed as human shields, using the claim of eliminating terrorists and terrorist infrastructure as cover for total and complete destruction, accompanied, as we had in Gaza, by gleeful videos posted by IDF soldiers celebrating the dehumanization and destruction of Lebanese. And now, as of this weekend, we have the open ethnic cleansing, not just the Litani River, but all the way to the Awali River. So that continues. In addition, we have bombing in Beirut, not just the southern suburbs, and beyond. So today we had the bombing of a Christian Maronite village in northern Lebanon. This is, I think, 100 kilometers or so northeast of Beirut, where around 20 people were killed. On top of that, we've got the UN, huge numbers killed in Lebanon, in Gaza, continued assault on UNRWA, with now the UNRWA facilities in Jerusalem being seized by Israel. And of course, we have attacks on UN peacekeepers, attacks and threats against UN peacekeepers in Lebanon, and the UN Secretary General banned from Israel. So there's that and much more. Now we're going to dive in. Moin. You recently participated in an event. It was entitled Public Forum on Israel-Gaza War 1 Year Later. I'll have a link to that in the show notes. It's terrific. People should watch it. During your presentation, you stated in explaining what we are seeing today in Lebanon and vis-a-vis Iran, Quote, Israel has decided the time is ripe to transform the balance of power in the Middle East by dismantling the axis of resistance piece by piece. Israel seems to today genuinely believe it is capable of producing an impact similar to that which followed its June 1967 war victory, this time by crushing Iran rather than Egypt. So, to get us started, can you first talk to us about what you mean by the axis of resistance?
Well, the axis of resistance, or resistance front, as it variously calls itself, is a coalition of states, movements, and militias in the Middle East that share a common agenda of confronting and reducing US and Israeli influence in the Middle East. I think it's important to point out that it's a coalition rather than alliance. The bonds between its various members are different. Some are stronger, some are weaker. It's often represented incorrectly, I believe, as an alliance in which Iran is a central figure and all the others are proxies of Iran that basically act according to an Iranian agenda rather than their own. And the way the Israelis and their supporters like to put it is that this axis is an octopus in which Iran is the head and the various members, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and so on, are its tentacles. I think it would be more accurate to look at the role of Iran in this coalition as having more in common with that of the role Germany plays within the European Union than, for example, the role the Soviet Union played within the Warsaw Pact, because it has different levels of influence and control over different members. So you have some militias in Syria and Iraq that I think could legitimately be characterized as Iranian proxies. Then you have, for example, Ansar Allah, the Houthis in Yemen, whose bonds with Iran have been strengthened under the pressure of the Saudi-led war against them. And then you have a movement like Hamas, which comes from, on the one hand, comes from very different tradition. It's aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood rather than the revolutionary stream of Shia Islam represented by Iran, and has been kind of a hesitant member. So, for example, when the civil war broke out in Syria, Hamas, whose exiled leadership was headquartered in Damascus at that point, broke with the Syrian government and left not for Beirut or Tehran, but to Doha, as a result of which its relations with Iran, in fact, ruptured for the better part of half a decade. And then you have Hezbollah, which is very closely aligned with Iran ideologically, and subscribes to many of the same principles that the regime in Iran does, but at the same time, and was in fact founded primarily with on the basis of assistance from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in the 1980s in response to a previous Israeli invasion of Lebanon, but has reached a level of influence and power that, as I would put it, its most important decisions are taken in Beirut, albeit in consultation with Iran, rather than in Tehran on behalf of Lebanon.
That's a really helpful framing. I think the oversimplification in a lot of people's minds of what is this axis of resistance, and the sort of simplifying to the extent that there is perceived to be no agency and no objectives of the groups on the ground, I think leads to some really bad analysis of what's actually happening. So thank you for that.
If I
Um,
can just interrupt, I
please.
mean, there's a lot of precedent for this in the 1970s and the 1980s. Groups like the PLO and the Sandinistas in Nicaragua and elsewhere were also presented as Soviet proxies, basically that these were not groups fighting on behalf of their own agenda for objectives that had nothing to do with the Soviet Union, even if they were aligned with it, but rather these were groups operating purely on behalf of some kind of Soviet master plan. And it's very similar what we're seeing now in much of what passes for analysis of the axis of resistance.
No, I smiled as you were saying that because I was thinking about the allegations that all the protests in the U.S. are essentially, acting on behalf of or directed by either Hamas or Iran, as if there is no agency of
Hmm.
students who see genocide and want to
Yeah.
protest it. So I want to just continue on this line. So you talk about this Israel sees this moment, right? I
Mm.
want you to talk about why Israel has decided that now is the time to try to effect a remaking of the Middle
Yes.
East. And I also want, and let me just break this down a little bit and answer this however you want. I'm curious, to what extent do you see this as having been a long held objective and now they see an opportunity? How much of this do you think is about domestic politics? We hear a lot of people talking about everything being driven by Bibi's personal political exigencies. And how much of it do you see as being a genuine national policy agenda, maybe
Mm.
grounded in messianism or revanchism or a quasi-fascist militarism? And how much is just simply opportunism or something
Yeah.
else?
Well, it doesn't have to be either or. It can be several or even all of the above. Regarding Iran, I mean, people often forget Iran and Israel had an outstanding relationship until 1979, just as Saudi Arabia and Iran until that year also had a close relationship. But since 1979, there's clearly been hostility between Iran and Israel, even though Israel, of course, along with the United States, sold arms to Iran during the 1980s during its war with Iraq and what's known as Iran-Contra scandal. But on the whole, um, regime change in Tehran has been the ultimate objective of both the US and of Israel. But having said that, I mean, it's not something that they've necessarily actively pursued over the years. It's kind of, the ultimate objective, but the more active policy, let's say, has been what might be called containment, to keep Iran isolated regionally, to keep Iran economically weak through sanctions and so on, and of course, opposition to any Iranian nuclear program, whether military or civilian. So that's by way of background. Now, what has changed during the past year is that, as you know, on October 7th, the Israeli leadership was in disarray. And its initial response to the attacks in southern Israel was kind of a maniacal, ultimately genocidal campaign against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip that seemed to be driven by bloodlust and revenge more than any clear conception of strategy. Um, but I think we began to see a change over the summer, where Israel began to feel increasingly confident in its posture. And I think the key turning point here was when it shifted its attention to the north, to Lebanon, and managed to conduct a series of very successful attacks against Hezbollah. First, it managed to assassinate its chief of staff, Fuad Shukr, in Beirut in late July. Then you had these pager and walkie-talkie attacks. Then you had massive bombings of Hezbollah and other Lebanese targets in Lebanon. And ultimately, you then had the assassination of Hezbollah's iconic general secretary, Hassan Nasrallah. And I think um, Israel's ability to inflict so many severe hits against Hezbollah in such a compressed period of time gave Israel the confidence that Hezbollah was no longer a sustainable organization, that it was imploding, that it was about to collapse. And Israel looks at Hezbollah as the forward post of Iran. In other words, that Israel in any direct confrontation with Iran would have to primarily incur the wrath of Hezbollah in terms of massive Hezbollah missile barrages on Israel. And it seems to have reached the conclusion that it had hit Hezbollah so severely in Lebanon that with one more push, if you will, it could eradicate Hezbollah, or at least eliminate it as a significant military force. And then it began looking at the region more broadly. It called its operation Operation New Order, for those who were familiar with 1940s Europe. And Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, began addressing the Iranian people that freedom is coming to you even sooner than you think. And Israel really began to engage in a kind of hubris, I think we last saw in 1982 with Israel's invasion of Lebanon, meant to reorder the region, or Condoleezza Rice's famous birth pangs of the Middle East in 2006. And it really began to acquire the confidence, the hubris, whatever you want to call it, that Israel was now in an optimal position to fundamentally transform the strategic equation of the Middle East. And the US, which, as you know, for most of the past year, its contradictory actions aside, has continually spoken out against regional escalation, now appear to be fully on board with it. In other words, they saw an opportunity that didn't exist before, that in this moment of crisis, things that had been only theoretical or hypothetical suddenly seemed practical. I'll just address one more issue, which is about Netanyahu personally. Obviously, he's interested in his political survival. But there was a recent interview with actually the author of this extraordinarily criminal general's plan now being implemented in Gaza, former Israeli senior military officer and national security advisor named Giora Eiland, where the interviewer asked him, what about Netanyahu's Churchill complex, referring to Netanyahu's constant talk of total victory and so on. And Eiland's response, I thought, was on the mark. He said the issue with Netanyahu is not a Churchill complex, it's an FDR complex. And what he meant by that is that FDR, of course, was a US president when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. And had FDR left office in disgrace at that point, the only reason people would remember him is that the one who oversaw this catastrophe. But rather, he stayed on. He did die before the end of the Second World War, but he's now remembered as a person who took the United States to the brink of victory during World War II. And the suggestion is that another motivation for Netanyahu is that if he manages to fundamentally alter the strategic equation in the Middle East, he will be remembered primarily not for October 7th and his failures on that date, but for his success in fundamentally transforming the Middle East strategic equation. And I also think that's true not only of him, but of many of his cohorts in Israel's political and military leadership.
Yeah, I find myself, as you're telling that story, thinking back to the Iraq War. I wrote an article. I had a meeting with then Congressman Tom Lantos, with an Israeli diplomat at the time, and he was talking about how, this is going to reorder the Middle East, and we raised our concerns that it might reorder it in a way that wouldn't be great. And he said you're wrong. You're thinking about this wrong. He said the Middle East is like a kaleidoscope. If you just pick it up and look through it, you don't see anything beautiful. But if you shake it up and then look through it, whatever you see is more beautiful than what you had before, which seemed to me like a uh, a really irresponsible way of making U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah,
Um,
well, Lantos was
there you
wrong
go.
about practically everything else, so I'm not
Yeah,
surprised he was wrong about this as well.
but that sort of leads into the next question, which is, okay, you're going to remake the Middle East. What does that Middle East look like? I mean, it's not simply enough to say we want to reorder the Middle East so that we come out on top. What, in your understanding or your
Mm.
speculation, what does Netanyahu, what does your island imagine that this new Middle East looks like? And in particular, within this new Middle East, which presumably includes, rearranged borders and maybe some countries disappear, what is the future for Palestinians? What is the future for Lebanese? What is the future for Jordan and Jordanians?
Mm,
Does Jordan
mm.
still exist? What about Egypt? I mean, have people sort of thought through what that looks like?
They have, but not necessarily very deeply. But I think it does have several central elements. The first, of course, is that the axis of resistance, which we were just discussing, is dismantled piece by piece. So Hamas is eliminated primarily in the Gaza Strip, but also elsewhere. Um, Hezbollah is basically crushed and survives, if at all, as a marginal and insignificant social movement, and no longer has a role in Lebanese politics, certainly not in Israeli-Arab conflict, and absolutely no regional role anymore, which has been an important source of its strength and influence in recent decades. The Houthis are removed from power in Sana'a, and ultimately, Iran is transformed. I think perhaps in the aftermath of Iraq, which we were just discussing, people may be a little more sober about the prospects and consequences of regime change in Iran. But it is a program that has many advocates. You know, you have people arguing for the restoration of the Pahlavi monarchy or other changes. But if there's no regime change in Iran, then at least Iran is no longer in a position to project power regionally, as maintained is remains economically weak, does not have a viable nuclear program that gets within 100 miles of a military nuclear program, and so on. And so Iran is weakened, contained, and isolated. The other main element of it is Arab-Israeli normalization. Traditionally, of course, the way people have thought about Arab-Israeli normalization is it's the outcome of Israeli-Palestinian peace. In other words, when Israel withdraws from the occupied territories and a Palestinian state is established, then Israel is rewarded, if you will, with normalized relations with the Arab
Otherwise known
states.
as the Arab Peace Initiative model.
Exactly. Land for peace, if you will. That's now been turned on its head. Arab-Israeli normalization precedes Israeli-Palestinian peace, but not in order to jumpstart Israeli-Palestinian peace, but rather in order to marginalize and isolate and weaken the Palestinians so that they are thoroughly subject to Israel's will, so that Israel can annex the occupied territories. And over time, you know, Palestinians will gradually begin to emigrate, whether to the Gulf or Jordan or farther beyond. And I think it unstated, or at least it's not officially stated in Israel, but it's an idea that is once again gaining currency among certain sectors of Israeli politics, is that Jordan is a Palestinian entity, and Palestinians have no right to self-determination in their homeland. If they're going to insist on any political rights, those rights or national rights, those should be expressed in the Arab world and primarily in Jordan. And I think, you know, the way other people perhaps look at it is that the growing relationships and ties that the traditionally pro-Western Arab client regimes in Egypt and in the Gulf have developed with Russia and China since the end of the Cold War. Those will be kind of constrained to strategically insignificant economic and trade relationships. That I think that's kind of the general idea behind this, so that Israel becomes, you know, once again the gatekeeper of Western interests in the region, and the Arab states and others have a strategic relationship solely with Israel and the United States, and not with emerging world powers, Russia, China, BRICS, whatever.
So built into what you've just described is either a good deal of ethnic cleansing and genocide beyond what we've already seen, or a lot of wishful thinking based upon the idea that you can truly repress people into total submission in the long term, or if they fight that, you can just keep killing them. I think it's worth pointing out that after a year of pure genocidal actions, Israel has by no measure succeeded in quote unquote eliminating Hamas, and that whatever is left of Hamas is still fighting the IDF in Gaza and still inflicting real damage, which Israel, I think, tries to keep out of the headlines. Likewise, notwithstanding what you described, the attacks on Hezbollah in country, the assassinations, the huge explosions to kill their leader, Hezbollah fighters are still inflicting damage on the IDF, particularly wherever there's been any ground incursions on Lebanon. And I think it was on Saturday we saw Hezbollah manage to get a drone into Israel, into an Israeli military base, and kill 4 soldiers. So there's still capacity there. In addition, it's not probably we shouldn't overlook that the Houthis, who I think people really thought were, the B or C team, are still massively wreaking havoc on shipping in the Red Sea, notwithstanding both the US and Israel conducting attacks against them. And then, of course, there is the threat of what Iran might do. So I want to ask you, first of all, to talk about what you see as the continued or so far preserved, whatever capacity is left right now in this axis of resistance a year after Hamas's attack on Israel that launched us into this new drama.
Well, let's start with Hamas. Of all of Israel's military adversaries, the Qassam brigades, the military wing of Hamas, is indisputably the weakest of the bunch. If you compare its military capabilities to either Hezbollah or the Houthis or some of these others, um, it's not only much weaker, it's also operating in the smallest territory in the entire Middle East, the Gaza Strip, which is, postage stamp size territory that is all of 365 square kilometers. And Israel's relentless campaign over the course of an entire year, with some of the most intensive bombings per square inch in recorded history and all the rest of it, has failed to destroy Hamas. I'm not in a position to say whether it's still relatively intact or significantly weakened. It's obviously been degraded, but we don't know how much. But it's still able to fight and do battle with Israelis, which are still regularly incurring casualties and blown up tanks and APCs and all the rest of it. So that's the first part of it. So imagine how much more trouble Israel is going to be encountering, or already is encountering in Lebanon, where Hezbollah is a much larger, much more highly trained, much better resourced armed movement that has sophisticated drones, apparently has hypersonic ballistic missiles, can probably launch more missiles at Israel should it choose to do so in one day than Hamas has fired at Israel during its entire existence, and so on. And then Hezbollah, for its part, pales by comparison with Iran. So the idea that this coalition can be militarily defeated with a single campaign or a single hammer blow is, I think, just wishful thinking. But let's presume it's realistic. Let's presume that next Monday, we wake up, Hamas no longer exists, and all the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip have been pushed into Egypt, and those in the West Bank into Jordan. Well, what would happen then? Well, we have very clear historical precedent, the Nakba of 1948, and the contemporary Palestinian national movement, in fact, emerged primarily in the camps of exile in Jordan, in Syria, in Lebanon. And when Israel sought to destroy them in 1982 with the invasion of Lebanon, not only did it fail, but the effort to do so led to the emergence of a new and much more savvy, I would say, military adversary named Hezbollah, which we're talking about today.
Yeah, I think people may often forget that Hezbollah was a direct byproduct of the 1982 war on Lebanon.
Yes.
Just sticking on this question of the capacity of the axis of resistance right now, um, what are their how do you see their objectives and their options right now? I mean, I guess what I'm thinking of is it right now if you're Hamas in the West Bank, Gaza in the West Bank, you're Hezbollah in Lebanon, is it just about surviving? Are there continued objectives of somehow pushing Israel out, regaining territory? And to what degree does or might Israel's scorched earth approach to the civilian population, something that I know from my own research, Hamas leaders feared being blamed for the kind of thing that's happening in Gaza today. Nasrallah did not want to be blamed for bringing down the wrath of Israel on all of Lebanon again. It's happened, right? Israel has said we're making no distinction, we're destroying everything. How does that change the calculation of whoever retains capacity?
Mm.
I mean, and it's striking to me that the drone that managed to get into Israel over the weekend was actually aimed at a military base and
Mm.
not at a civilian target.
Mm.
Particularly when, after the last Iranian missiles came into Israel, the Israeli memes on social media were all about, see, Tel Aviv was standing before and it's standing after. After, look at these losers, they couldn't hit our civilian structures because, frankly, it appears they aimed at
Yes.
legitimate military sites. Does that change?
Well, I think it's important to make some distinctions here. Israel, as known by its Dahya doctrine, which calls for premeditated, deliberately disproportionate attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. In fact, this is a doctrine that goes back long before it was unleashed in 2006 against the southern suburbs of Beirut. But Israel targets civilians and civilian infrastructure as a matter of policy. Turn to the Palestinians. I would argue that Palestinian armed movements have, as a rule, not made much of a distinction between military and civilian targets. We saw this, for example, quite clearly during the Second Intifada, quite clearly during the attacks of October 7th, and so on. Then you look at Hezbollah, which I think its history has been marked by an understanding that perhaps in contrast to many other societies, Israeli society is actually more sensitive to military than to civilian casualties. Military casualties seem to undermine the Israeli public sense of confidence in its leadership much more than attacks on civilian targets, which I think would be the case in many other countries. And Hezbollah has always been very careful to prioritize and focus on military targets and to hit civilian targets really only as reprisals for unbridled Israeli attacks on Lebanese civilian targets. And I think if you look at Gaza versus Lebanon during the past year, up until a month or two ago, I found it quite telling that in Gaza, the casualties were overwhelmingly civilian, whereas on the Israeli-Lebanese border, among both Israelis and Lebanese, there were comparatively few civilian casualties, both in absolute numbers and as a proportion of all casualties. And many of those civilian casualties could legitimately be described by that exceptionally sordid term of collateral damage rather than being deliberately targeted. And I think this demonstrates Hezbollah's real success over the years of insulating civilians, and particularly its popular base and constituents, from conflict with Israel. Just to go back to April 1996, the so-called Grapes of Wrath understandings that ended an Israeli offensive against Hezbollah in exchange of fire over the border, it codified that henceforth civilian targets were prohibited. And that was seen as a strategic success, not for Israel, but for Hezbollah. And so, to get back to your question, I think part of Hezbollah's support and reputation has been its ability to insulate its popular base and its constituency in Lebanon from the kind of Israeli violence that we've seen in the Gaza Strip in the past year and in the occupied territories more generally. To what extent has that changed now with the extraordinary, the exponential escalation of Israeli violence in Lebanon? I don't know. My suspicion is that at least for Hezbollah's constituents and supporters, it probably hardens their attitudes rather than undermines their trust and confidence in Hezbollah, particularly because Hezbollah appears to have successfully absorbed the massive blows that were dealt to it during the past few months and is now hitting back at Israel increasingly. In Gaza, it's, I think, a little bit of a different picture, both because of the kind of fragmented and divided nature of the Palestinian political arena over recent decades, because the Palestinian Authority is not playing a prominent role in advocating for the lives and well-being of those it claims to lead and want to rule. And I mean, I wouldn't at all be surprised to learn that there are segments of Palestinian society in the Gaza Strip who hold Hamas as responsible as Israel for the cataclysm that they're undergoing. But at the same time, I would also suspect there are other sectors of the population who were previously indifferent to Hamas or not particularly supportive of it, who now want to be part of its campaign, either because they saw that Hamas managed to deal a unprecedented blow against Israeli military doctrine on October 7th, or because they want revenge for everything that's happened during the past year, or because they view the Palestinian Authority and Fatah and others as non-viable competitors at this stage.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I guess I find myself thinking if past is prelude, so 1982, you get Hezbollah. Somebody pulled up, I think it was someone pulled up on social media reminding us that Osama bin Laden, by his own account in a speech, which was in the Guardian, I'll have a link to that, said he was inspired to attack America by Israel's 1982 attack on Lebanon. He was very explicit. So if the past is prelude, should we be concerned for Israel and for the world in general that we are seeing the seeds being sown for new generations who will embrace violence as a tool either to achieve rights or justice or retribution, and that includes both those who are survivors of the horror show in Gaza and Lebanon today or in Yemen, and those who are radicalized by what they're seeing every day in the news and the images. I mean, the bodies burning. I can't get that out of my head today. These atrocities every day. So I guess I want, maybe it's unfair to ask you to speculate on this, but assuming Israel manages to reorder the Middle East in the way that it likes,
Mhm.
for those of us who were children in the pre-Madrid era when there was, the international challenge of terrorism, what do you conclude, or what do you speculate
Well,
there?
it's both a very interesting and I think a very important question. As you noted, Osama bin Laden claimed that the seeds of 9/11 were planted in his heads while watching images of the destruction of Beirut during Israel's 1982 invasion of Lebanon. Either that statement is true, or Osama bin Laden believed that appealing to the sense of Arab injustice because of uh, the crimes of Israel supported by the West was a very effective recruiting tool for him. So it was either one or the other. Now, you look at what's happening in Gaza today, and on the one hand, you can make the argument that it's orders of magnitude compared to what happened in Lebanon in 1982, and that it's also much easier, given changes in the media landscape and so on, that it's much easier to seek to mobilize people in response to what has happened. And it's quite easy to think that there are, radical extremist groups like ISIS, for example, which has, never really sought any involvement in Palestine, but will use the outrage and the anger generated by this as a recruiting tool to then divert those it is able to recruit to its own agenda, whether it's anti-Shiite pogroms or whatever it might be. But I think there's another key difference between 1982 and 2024, and it's one that I genuinely hope will make a real impact. If you remember 1982, there was very little public opposition to what Israel was doing. It was really the first time that Western public opinion was confronted with what Israel really is when it comes to its dealings with the Palestinian people. Um, this time, it's an absolute sea change. People who are old enough remember 1982 or the first Intifada. Younger people have been exposed to Israel's actions and conduct during the second Intifada or its previous onslaughts on the Gaza Strip, and the actions of settlers and the army in the West Bank and so on. And the massive levels of outrage, on student campuses and demonstrations in Western capitals by labor unions, um, which used to be centers of support for Israel, if you will. I think, when many people look at this growing chasm between ruler and ruled, between governments and public opinion, when it comes to Palestine, that may well have a very significant dampening effect on these kinds of on the kind of issues that you raised. Having said that, it's of course, like you said, it's only speculation. There is, I think, much greater outrage at the role of the West and than can be stated in a few words. But at the same time, I think we're also going to see something like a 1948 effect within the region. And by that, I mean the decade of turmoil that followed 1948 in the Middle East in response to the failure of the Arab regimes that then existed to prevent the Nakba. There's two important differences. In 1948, the Arab states, or at least several of them, directly fought in Palestine, but were defeated. This time, they are not directly involved, so people will not be responding to the defeat of their own armies. But by the same token, they have looked on as spectators, which is arguably much worse than at least trying and failing.
All right, I have a whole list of questions still, but we're getting to the what I think we need to end. So I'm gonna come to one more question, and it's a biggie. Um, so over the weekend, the Defense Department announced that the U.S. is sending a major U.S. missile defense system to Israel, along with 100 U.S. troops. We'll now have boots on the ground, more than what we already have that we don't really talk about that we have. This is on top of the more than 50,000 tons of U.S. armaments sent to Israel since October 2023. That is as published by the Israeli Defense Ministry in August. And that's on top of the help the U.S. military provided in intercepting Iranian rockets fired on Israel on October 1st and on April 13th. There's an article in the Washington Post about this yesterday, and they quote Harrison Mann, who is a former U.S. Army officer who served as an analyst at Defense Intelligence Agency. He also resigned in protest. He said, once this battery is in place and Israel enjoys the protection of American air defenders, what incentive does Netanyahu have to keep his word and not strike the sensitive targets in Iran he promised to avoid? So I think the question I want to end with is, the U.S. today, I would contend, is not just acquiescing to Israel opening the door for regional war, but is actively supporting Israel in the actions and policies and quite literally enabling such a war, if not making it inevitable. So, to
Mhm.
what extent is this a matter of the tail, which is Israel or supporters of Israel in the US, wagging the dog? We hear a lot about that, and on the eve of a US election. And to what extent do you see this as a convergence of shared, what I would call neocon or neocon like aspirations and objectives that are shared by Israeli leaders and key actors in the US national security leadership from both parties or something else?
Well, it's I think a key question, and just as a matter of observation, tails don't wag dogs. Dogs wag their tails. And in this case, I think it's no different. Given the figures you just mentioned, it's very difficult to come across an article in the press that doesn't refer to Hezbollah as being Iranian armed or Iranian supported. But we very rarely see the Israeli military referred to as the US armed Israeli military or the US supported um, uh, Israeli military. I think what we're seeing here is not only a convergence, but perhaps even sponsorship. So this kind of reordering of the Middle East that we were talking about, I suspect that in this case, it initiated within Israel as it gained its confidence on account of its successes against Hezbollah over the summer. There have been press reports that Israel was encouraged to escalate its attacks by key figures in the Biden administration, Brett McGurk in the National Security Council, and so on. And I think we need to understand that there is no way Israel would undertake any of these actions without either a U.S. green light or the confidence that there would be no consequences for them. We keep hearing U.S. spokesmen say, "Oh, we only learned of this when the Israelis informed us." I mean, who are they kidding? The U.S. and Israel have a very close intelligence relationship among the many other relationships. The U.S. warned us months in advance about Russia's intention to invade Ukraine. But somehow we are to believe that the U.S. knows absolutely nothing about Israel unless and until informed by Israel. I mean, they're really playing us for fools. But to get back to your question,
And we're
yes,
also to believe that there's no leverage, and therefore Israel
yes,
must be allowed to act with impunity at all times.
yes, and so leverage only exists if you choose to use it, and if you respond to Israeli actions, which you say you oppose, by ensuring that there's a veto in the Security Council, by sending more weapons and all the rest of it. Well, then you can't say you don't have leverage. You can say that you acquiesce in this or that you actively support it. But to get back to the beginning of your question, it's quite clear now that Washington is essentially not placing any restrictions on a potential, an inevitable, I would say, Israeli attack on Iran. I mean, there are Americans who may believe that they have a deal with Israel, that if Israel avoids certain targets, the U.S. will deploy this anti-missile battery. But once it's there, as anyone, with just a few brain cells understands, it's the equivalent of giving Israel a blank check. Because let's say there's an agreement not to hit Iranian nuclear reactors, and Israel hits them anyway. Does anyone believe this missile battery is going to be flown back to Utah or wherever it's based? Of course not.
Yeah, and I think that's the key point. It really comes down to not only allowing impunity, but almost
Yes.
incentivizing contempt for U.S. positions such as they are. All right, I think we're gonna have to wind it up here. I'd love to have you back for a conversation. I have a whole bunch of questions I didn't get to, but we ran out of time. Thank you so much, Wayne, for sharing your time
Thank you, Lara. I
analysis
look forward to it.
today. Thank you to our listeners for tuning into this episode of Occupied Thoughts. Please make sure to check out the website, www.fmep.org, for resources related to this podcast, lots of other great content, and check us out on SoundCloud, iTunes, and Spotify. And absolutely, you should be following Mouin on Twitter. He's at Mouin Rabbani, Rabbani, content you don't want to miss. And with that, I'm Lara Friedman. Thank you, Mouin Rabbani. Signing off until the next episode of Occupied Thoughts.